I believe that Western civilization kind of died in the 1960s, and it had been dying for a long time. And it was basically left, we were left inside this imaginative rubble of death, of civilizational death. And we've been living there ever since. And that there was a kind of a compensatory alternative arc to compensate for this dying process. And I would call that something like social democracy, which really began about 200 years ago to rev itself up and really was in full bloom in the first half of the 20th century. And I believe that it peaked in the 1960s at the same time that our civilization, Western civilization, died completely. So the Western civilization completely lost its compass in the 1960s and hasn't regained it since. And at that time, social democracy peaked and has been in decline ever since. Now, it's not dead; it's just in decline. It's still going. It's just that it doesn't have the inspirational energy that built it up in the first place. So people, 100 years ago, people really believed in, for example, universal education and public water works and vaccination and these type of things. And these and now we're in an age where all of this is subject to various doubts.
So in a way, it's kind of a supernova, right? It's totally it's everywhere right now, but it's dying. Okay.
You're the one who put the supernova idea in my head, which I've been using ever since. It's a great idea. It's fantastic. So yeah. So the social democracy has been in decline since the 60s. Now there's another compensatory arc that has been built up and compensated for the decline of social democracy. And that I would call, in a loose kind of way, Reaganism. And this phenomenon was basically, people think of it as conservative, maybe it is, but really it's militarism creating a new overarching arc.
Isn't it usually called, I don't like this term either, neoliberalism? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, yes. I mean, that has to do with deregulating and liberalizing trade and all that kind of stuff. And that's a complicated thing. And I think it was an inevitable thing, given what we, in the 20th century, we had built, in the mid 20th century, we had built up all kinds of trade tariffs to protect our national economies. And by the late 1970s, that wasn't working so well anymore, and we were getting nervous. There was high unemployment, high interest rates, all things weren't working so well, and so there was a big shift. Now that shift, people could see that coming. It wasn't. People could see that it wasn't working, and they saw that for at least 10 years, from 1970 to 1980. There was this decline in the manner in which we had a cradle to grave vision of our society. And highly regulated with massive trade tariffs to protect these national economies. Now that got blown out of. I think it was inevitable to liberalize trade, and because it just had to happen. There was no way that was going to carry on forever. These massive trade barriers. For one, what it does is it completely corrupts borders, because anywhere where there's customs, where you're passing, like a port, for example, anywhere where there's lots of goods going in and out, you would have all kinds of corrupt means to get goods through tariffs. Well, the easiest way to get rid of that corruption is to simply liberalize it all and just allow goods to flow in and out liberally without any monitor, or without any significant monitoring. So that kind of thing was inevitable. Anyway, I'm basically yeah. You're making a good point that the liberalization of trade came along with the heavy militarization of the United States, which really created a brand new arc for the Western world. People don't realize, I think, how much influence that has had on our lives. The internet, for example, is entirely indebted to the American military. And we are completely centered on the internet these days. Cell phones, I think, would never have happened if it weren't for the American military complex. So we are now, I believe, in an age where this particular compensatory arc, which was designed to compensate for the decline of social democracy, is also in decline. Which leaves us with another search for a new arc to compensate for the decline of this one. And what is that arc? And that's the key question. And I think one of the problems is we don't have a satisfactory, people, whether I was raised to hate Reaganism and mostly did for most of my life. The older I've gotten, the more I've seen the reasoning that runs through it. But nonetheless, it was a popular. It needs to be admitted that it was an extremely popular movement. Reagan was a very popular president. Now, he was unpopular elsewhere, but he still was met with a huge amount of support. Thatcherism in England was extremely popular.
I was thinking about Thatcherism. That's kind of the same movement. You would put those two together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Thatcherism also is hated in England, but nonetheless had enough popularity to keep this cultural arc, running through the English experience for a long time. And so it was basically, this was a compensatory cultural arc designed, I think, to compensate for the decline of social democracy, which was no longer working to the extent that it had been working in prior decades. The success of social democracy is convoluted completely by the wars, incidentally. It's hard to, I've become increasingly, I was raised a social democrat and have increasingly become very skeptical of the idea that it was a good thing. The wars completely obscure whether or not social democracy is good. In fact, social democracy might be the central subject of the wars. I mean, Nazi Germany, after all, was Nazis was a National Socialist Party. It was a socialist national party with a national economic vision for its country. This is to me synonymous with social democracy. It wasn't democratic in the sense that they had free elections once they were elected throughout elections, so it's complicated. Anyway, so all I'm saying is we are asking ourselves right now, I'm asking myself, what is the new arc that is compensating for the decline of both social democracy and Reaganism? I think that there's a huge number of people who think that finally Reaganism has run out of gas. Thank God we can return to our good old social democratic cradle to grave, our sensible vision of society, when in fact that's not what's happening. And
but there's also something else, another compensatory movement, which is kind of a neoconservative compensatory movement, right? Where people are saying, let's go back to church I think one of the reasons why we're in trouble right now is we are very radically polarized about what this particular arc is. Mm-hmm. While it was relatively clear that Reaganism was the name of the game in the 80s, and just as it was relatively clear that social democracy was the name of the game in the 50s or whatever, where there was, we were building university. I just want to say, like, the whole movement of the Jordan Peterson movement is like, it's almost like a nostalgic for Reaganism in some ways. Much of it, right? There's a nostalgic aspect for, okay, let's look at the cold. It's almost like he wants the Cold War mentality to come back.
In a way, yeah.
I'm fond of Peterson, but I feel that there is a reactionary element to that rather than looking at the new thing.
The extent to which Peterson intonates that, I think it's an intonation. He doesn't say it clearly. It's a kind of a feeling. He intimates it. I don't agree with that side of Peterson. I agree with other things. Unlike yourself, I like Peterson, but I also see that he's basically saying it was better before. Well, I don't think that. I think there's something else. We're struggling to find a new arc. Yeah. And wokeism is one of those struggles. You're right. This radical conservatism. I don't know if the outright is that. I don't know. But these are all struggles to create a new arc. And my view is that we need to return to subsistence economy as a base support for the liberal money economy that we have. But that doesn't appear to be in the works in any serious kind of way. So that's where I would lean. So basically, that's all I'm saying. That Reaganism was designed to compensate for the decline of social democracy. Social democracy was designed to compensate for the death of Western civilization. And really, what we're what we're struggling is to resurrect something out of Western civilization. I think maybe it's time. Maybe it's time for the civilization to rise from the ashes in some kind of way. Maybe returning to church is an expression of that. I'm not convinced. I'm attracted to the idea of going to church a bit, but I'm not convinced.
My view is there has to be a return, at least to sort of the primordial traditions, but they also have to be reinvented. So just returning to them as they are right now, it's kind of what Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson, and they're always saying that, return to Christendom. I think that we do have to find Christendom again, but not in the sense of going back to the Middle Ages in any way at all. That's what the conservatives kind of, you get the feeling that they want to go back to the Middle Ages, and that's where I have this resistance.
So we have these black marks on our civilizational record. We're anti-Semites for one. We are warmongering for two.
We're colonialists,
we're imperialistic. I've spent a lot of time looking at each and every one of those and defending the West inside of those. And maybe that's the thing, that the darkest chapters, the darkest features of us has to be properly and completely addressed. And then once that happens, maybe it's just full steam ahead. I don't know. I think there's a lot of totally false criticisms of the West. For example, that it's patriarchal and oppressive of women. I think that's an outrageous misconception of the Western world, and Western women are way better off than anyone else. That it's an environmental catastrophe. That's another, I think mistaken idea. But there are real ideas. Anti-Semitism is a real black mark. War. Lots and lots of war is a real black mark. I mean, Europe was at war way more, it seems, than other parts of the world. Maybe I'm mistaken in thinking that.
Well, the 30 Years' War and all that.
Those wars were just terrible. And imperialism is also defensible because you've heard my arguments about imperialism. When you're stronger than the guy next door, you kind of have no choice but to take them over. And this has to do with neurosis. It's the idea that I'm stronger for a certain reason.
Is that what's happening in Ukraine right now? Is that what?
Good question. No, I think that has to do with old sense of turf. One of the reasons why our arcs are losing steam, social democracy is less important than Western civilization. And in turn, Reaganism is less important than social democracy, and in turn, whatever's going on now is less important than Reaganism. And the reason is, you really need a civilization to boost and to have a real proper proper arc. So there's this massive arc that took, I don't know, 1,500 years or whatever, and and the other arcs are very short. And they seem to be getting shorter. It seems to me that the social democracy arc is like 200 years long, maybe 250 or something. Maybe there's another 50 years left. And the Reaganism one is much shorter if you're following the logic, right?
So they keep getting shorter and shorter, and then what happens?
It's crying out for a new civilizational arc to emerge,
which would be like the sort of after the apocalypse kind of.
I don't know.
In a way,
I don't. Good question. What? When you really feel like you're digging into something really and truly substantial, one of the problems with social democracy is it became a little bit taboo to discuss things like religion. In other words, even if people there were lots of people who believed in social democracy who were actually spiritualists, but they couldn't discuss it. So it became slowly filtered out. I was going to say banned, but that's too strong a word. It's over time filtered out any discussion of spirituality from the social democracy, and largely because it was unnecessary. The whole point was to provide, food, clothing, shelter, and education, and cradle to grave stuff. And cradle to grave doesn't feel particularly spiritual in its.
Well, there's something. There has to be something more than that. Obviously, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, you can understand why people believed in it, and people logged on, because it is very attractive that, you shouldn't have to worry about whether you're going to, make a living or have a meal or have clothing on your back. You shouldn't have that.
It's all about fairness, right? And things being fair.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's, I mean, Reaganism, it seems to me, is way more interesting. I mean, it's only in retrospect that only in recent last couple of years that I've given it any real thought. It's really about protecting the core interests of Western civilization, even though Western civilization is has no compass. So it's taking things like individualism and and then there's a religious side to Reaganism, traditional religion kind of thing, and it's also taking free market. These notions that are Western inventions are being defended. Basically, liberalism, not Christianity so much, but liberalism.
This is what kind of the whole of Peterson's platform right now seems to be about, defending liberalism. He seems entirely a Reaganist in the sense that you're talking about.
It seems to me that I've heard the argument that liberalism had to be defended by by sinking enormous amount of money into technological development so as to maintain a technological advantage for as long as possible, so that liberalism would persist as long as possible. And this was the ultimate argument that came out of the back rooms of Reaganism, and the argument being that the liberalism doesn't exist anywhere else. And so it'll get swamped. It's going to get swamped. The whole world, they don't have freedom of speech. They don't have all kinds of things. They don't have the market like we invented it. Now they do now because we've pushed it upon them. And so these things needed to be defended and needed to be stretched out as long as possible, knowing full well that they were under serious threat and that it was considered that the only way to protect them was technological advantage.
Well, what's the new? You think we have to get back to subsistence? You said, and
well, because it's the base. It's the base on which we can build a civilization. And you've heard me talk about waste repurposing and stuff, and that's a subsistence way to live, and it's way easier than living off the land and homesteading back in the past. Way easier. Because you have so much resource that's readily available to you, and already
we have so much garbage everywhere that we can repurpose to. It's just the whole world is full of garbage.
Massive mountains of garbage.
We use artificial intelligence to figure out a way to besides our own, our own methods.
So if we homestead,
use all that as energy.
If we homesteaded in an urban environment through waste repurposing, then we have, it seems to me, the beginnings, the first launching pad idea for a new civilization, because it gives people time. They get out of the rat race if they engage in that. We need a little bit of infrastructure in place before people will begin to believe in it. Right now, they don't believe in it because they don't see the infrastructural vision. But once the infrastructure is there a little bit, people will log on, and once they're in, they won't have to work so hard. They'll have time.
So what's the infrastructure? Is it the internet?
Good question.
The internet would be the meta-organizing principle of all of these, whatever the new civilization is going to be.
Well, because you can learn so much from the internet. You can teach yourself so much.
Well, also you can make instant connections with like-minded people towards doing similar projects.
Yes, yeah. So as an educational base, yes, absolutely. Yeah, the internet is an educational base, absolutely. So yeah, that's a good point. So waste repurposing, the internet, and you've heard me talk about small groups too. These are sort of base ideas upon which, once we realize that you don't have to be in the rat race, run, and you don't have to compete. This is one place where Peterson might be a little bit off. He's on it in so many ways, but he's absolutely right in saying the world is composed of competence hierarchies. But he's also right in saying that people mostly stack up at the bottom. But that's where his analysis stops. So the fact that people mostly stack up at the bottom of hierarchies is actually the most important thing. It's the most important observation.
maybe I'm
Why?
exaggerating.
Can you go explain that?
Because everybody's down there. Everybody's there.
Yeah.
And these hierarchies are basically focuses of activity, and that's great, but they all produce waste. So everything falls to the bottom. And so what do you do with that?
I mean, so there's a repurposing, let's say, of the basic materials, but then there's also the repurposing of talents.
Yes. But also you could argue that people at the bottom of all these are kind of waste as well. You know, they're not going anywhere.
Wasted lives, consumeriates, as Bard would call it, people who just consume and parasitical sort of existences.
Well, to be at the bottom of a hierarchy, to be at the bottom of a hierarchy is still to partake of a hierarchy. For example, you're interested in songwriting, but you're not going anywhere because you're not that good, but you're still interested in it. And you might meander around, you might develop a certain skill which gets you a job, and that's kind of puts you up a rung in the hierarchy. Maybe you
have a gig or something at the local tavern playing country western music or something, and so you're part of the hierarchy still, and there's still some dignity in that.
That's right.
But the waste is when you're outside of the whole thing, and you're just you are just parasitical, and you're not constructing anything, or you're not part of the creative endeavor of humanity.
There is a sense in which it's parasitical and consumeriate, I agree, but there's also a sense in which it's a necessary bottom. For example, you can't have a music industry without an audience. Now, are the audience, are they consumeriate? Are they consumeriate, or are they the bottom of the hierarchy where they simply listen to the music that's being presented? And and so what are they?
Well, and then one or two of them actually have some real talent and absorbs what they're being heard and then creates their new thing. But most of us just kind of are able to participate in it, which is a good kind of participation. I guess consumeriate means the way I'm thinking of it is when you're consuming garbage, you're consuming bad food, you're consuming Netflix. You're not. It's different than going to a good concert or something like that, right? Or going
I totally agree. There is that.
Or there's most definitely that, there's an enriching form of consuming, because we need to consume, on a literal level. But then there's also just a negative form of being hooked into the machine and just eating death.
Totally. I mean, I totally agree with you. I tend to think about that as little as possible, simply because it's too depressing. So I always look for the positive threads that are running through it. And so in the sense that we are a consumeriate, how is that positive? Well, you're looking for your own little purpose. You're looking for you may not have a purpose and you're looking for it. And then let's hope that you find it, and then off you go.
Yeah. That's a more charitable vision of people rather than saying that people are just slaves and they're slaves and masters.
Well, it seems to be fairly normal to have no rudder and to be out in the middle of the sea and just floating around in the doldrums. It's a very common, extremely common experience, and it just means that you haven't found a purpose, right? And so this notion of the consumeriate is it cynical to talk about someone who hasn't found a purpose, or is it simply an observation that someone has yet to find a purpose? You know what I'm saying? So the doldrums seem to be important because one of the reasons why not having a purpose, to have experienced that, is so important, because then you are able to recognize when you have one, and you're able to recognize how lucky, how fortunate you are to have a purpose, to actually have something to get up in the morning to do, because most of us have experienced these, years on end where we haven't got a clue what to do with ourselves, So that's in a sense to experience the doldrums is good. And so what I'm trying to do is critique this consumeriate, caught in the machine, as actually having a kind of a negative purpose. You have to experience no rudder, no direction, in order to know what direction is.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
But at the same time, I agree. It's a huge problem.
I like that. Yeah.
It's a huge problem.
But I mean, maybe it's this issue of addiction.
Absolutely.
And so that's when I think the bottom of society are people who are just fully addicted.
Totally. Now, I also think that you don't build a civilization unless you build it from the bottom. So, which brings us back to this bottom question.
So it's like what George Orwell said: if there's hope, it's in the proles, it's in the bottom.
Yeah,
it's kind of a Marxist. Oh, I don't know if Marx thought that either. Thought that
it seems to me that Marx had a kind of a shaving of truth there. He was onto something. It's just that the manner in which what he wanted to do was he blamed the rich and the powerful for keeping them down.
But he also blamed the lumpen proletariat. Like he wasn't like as he wasn't as romantic about the lower classes as people think. He was kind of an elitist. He wanted a group of special people to go, to bring them the revolution.
Hence social democracy. Social democracy. This is an idea I came up with the week. Social democracy is basically oligarchy. It's an elite group who have granted themselves the responsibility of ensuring the welfare of the poor.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. That's very good. Social democracy as an oligarchy.
Oh, it's absolutely. In fact, oligarchy, the whole notion about this is why social democrats use the word oligarchy to describe this marriage between government and business. And so the business is basically, but the truth is, the real truth is, business is rotating very, very quickly. It's an extremely competitive world, and people are being thrown out of that world all the time. I mean, I know there is an oligarchic dimension to that. Don't get me wrong, I know there is, but I think oligarchy really and truly depends primarily on social democracy, not on business, because business is because
government has ways of keeping the money without doing anything about it. So this is the parasitical aspect again.
Yeah.
And rather than providing real value, but
anyone who has a permanent relationship with government is oligarchy. You know, getting that?
Sure. Well, it's definitely like that in France, where I live. I mean, they have such a huge, powerful bureaucracy. It's like people study their whole lives to get into that special club to be a bureaucrat.
Yeah, that's right.
That used to be an insult. That's an insult in other places, but in France, if you're a bureaucrat, it's like you're set. You're in the bourgeois if you're a bureaucrat in France.
Now, to be a little bit fair, this isn't necessarily not necessarily an evil vision of how to run a country or how to run a land or a collective, but it is absolutely not a bottom-up vision.
No, and also it's probably out of date. It probably doesn't work with the internet age.
Yeah, that's right. That's the way and so the internet is pushing us right down to the bottom. It's making us extremely base in the way we communicate, the way we do things. And that's ultimately a good thing, although it scares the hell out of us because base humanity is terrifying. Terrifying in so many ways. Base sexuality is scary, but also people's lives are so boring and empty. That's terrifying. It terrifies me to see how empty people's lives are. But nonetheless, that it's pulled us right down to the base. I see that as something extremely exciting. And so the social democrat runs things from the middle and has this idea of lifting the bottom up to the middle. So nobody should be at the bottom because the bottom is an indecent, undignified reality, while the real task is to dignify the bottom because there is always a bottom. And so we got to get back down to the bottom. And we're getting there. We're being forced there by the internet. I agree with you completely about that. But and the amount of waste that scares the shit out of us, we're still turning a blind eye to that. But it is the solution, I think, because it has so much economic potential. But economic potential in a way which is not easily monetizable. Waste is not easily monetizable, which is why we have a tendency to turn a blind eye to it. We send our e-waste to Asia or whatever, where they have to deal with it, that kind of shit, right? Instead of actually dealing with
maybe an interesting conversation would be like, what is money in the internet age? What's happening to it?
I think money.
It's kind of out of my skill set, but there's something very interesting there in terms of like moving from money to attention and all that kind of thing.
Well, here's a provocative argument. Money has been for a long time far and away the most powerful tool that we have had at our disposal. However, it may have been undermined by the internet. So the internet may be a more powerful tool than money. Now, people say, well, no, we're just monetizing the internet, and it's just a different way to make money and all that kind of stuff. No, I'm not so sure. It seems to undermine money.
Yeah, it does.
You know,
I mean,
yeah.
in terms of my own projects and stuff, it seems to have created a different hierarchy, in the sense that a hierarchy of people who are, get together and are interested in a certain thing and they work together, instead of people who get together because they're from a certain social class. So so somebody might not have a lot of money, like myself, and then they could be on an equal level with the guy who has tons of money, but and conversely, a guy who has tons of money might be totally uninterested, maybe at the bottom of this hierarchy, because he has nothing interesting to say in that attentional, intellectual, or cutting edge realm.
Okay, so we're really onto something here now. So I think we agree on this, that the internet is some kind of a bottom expression, and I think it is, and so that's the whole. That's the educational.
What do you mean by bottom? I'm not quite there yet with what you mean by bottom, though.
Okay, so when I say bottom, I'm speaking about hierarchies. So hierarchies are like pyramids, right? They and so there's always.
So does it reverse the pyramid so that the bottom is actually the top, or everybody's equal, or does it flatten the hierarchy completely, or?
I don't know. I don't think it flattens the hierarchy. The bottom always has the most people in it, and there will always be someone at the top making crazy amounts of money, for example, because they figured it out. And so then there's competency. There's certain skills that get you a job where you're up a rung or two and all that kind of stuff. But still, most people are down at the bottom. And what do you do with those people? Well, you figure out a way to get them a job. Well, maybe the job will be low paying and not very meaningful. Or do you go back into the old time peasant model of homesteading, except in a modern urban subsistence context, right? So basically, I'm taking the peasant model and transferring it, throwing it into the modern urban context through the phenomenon of waste, but with the
so the urbanites are the peasant. The urbanites are the peasants in a way.
Yes, yeah. The bottom of cities are the new peasants, and the fact is, the rich are out buying land and having farms.
You have richer and big homestead places in Texas, and yeah.
But the peasant, the resourceful peasant, is down at the bottom, and they have the potential of forming new community as a result of that. It's because they're interacting, they're learning from each other, they're exchanging ideas, they're also exchanging goods and stuff, and exchanging skills.
There's this creative kind of melting pot,
And I think, not that I have no issue with money being in that world. If they can figure out a way to put money in that world, God love them. But
it's not the same. But it's not how you measure things.
Yeah,
necessarily, right?
It's not the primary principle.
Yeah, it's not
what you know and the resources you have around you. And you're right about the availability of the internet to help you figure something out. What are you gonna do with a certain resource or whatever, right? How can I make a wood stove or whatever? How can I build a house with these materials?
Yeah, well, I mean, we did this internet thing, Wednesday night meeting thing, and now we have a bunch of guys, and we have a little kind of online community, and they're going out and meeting in Amsterdam, and that's kind of like that's the parallel future to what's happening, let's say, outside of. Where people meet and then they form a little community and then they do stuff together. And then so they have most of their verbal communication and most of their, let's say, work is on the internet. And then they get together a couple times a year and have beers and have a congenial sort of, meeting where you meet in the flesh and
So that's the new model of education, and it's also a model.
New model of education.
Yeah, and it's also free. Right. That's the important thing. It doesn't cost any money. I mean, you can charge, but the thing is, I think the whole business of charging for internet education won't work.
No.
And the reason is,
we've kind of figured that out. We figured out that it has to be by donations, and it has to be by stipends, and it has to be by goodwill. Because you cheapen the whole project when you make it a product rather than an actual so we decided actually not to charge money for it.
How are
For
the
this
donations,
for this
by the way? Are
particular
they good?
project, but I mean, last year we charged. There was 50 euros or whatever a month, and you people were part of Manifesto, which was the other organization that hired me and Owen to do this. The problem was that yes, we made a little bit of money, but it wasn't enough. For one thing, it cheapened what we did because we were earning money. We would have felt better doing it without money, which is kind of ironic. But then, so the model, if we're going to do this, spend serious time on doing this, the model is patronage and donation, and that if for this kind of community, that's the only thing that works. And then you can charge money for let's say individual coaching, or you can charge money for one-on-one when you have somebody has a particular skill and they need that skill. Or you could charge money if you have Cadell has a philosophy course. He charges money for that because he has a particular skill. He's a philosophy teacher, and people want to join. That works because he's really good at it.
Yeah.
But for community, you keep that sacred on some level, right?
Totally. No, absolutely. And that's kind of brings back you. So, community is the same word as communion, right?
Yeah.
So the church communion, you never charge to go to church.
No, you pass around a little thing, and people put money, or you ask people for money because you need to run the thing.
Yeah, that's right.
But
it's always optional, and it's depends on the person.
But and also you become a member of the church because you're part of the community. You can't come in if you're not part of the community. Like there's a boundary around the community in some sense, right?
Yeah.
So if we accept you in the community, you can come. If you behave badly, you can't come in. So it's a decision between the people who run it and the community. So that's a community, and that's based on the sacred, not on. I mean, that's a religious word, but.
So just to summarize what I was saying, I think the return to a civilizational vision is a bottom-up one, and that's a simple idea. And we had that in the past with the peasant.
Mm-hmm.
Peasant was the king ruled over the land, but the peasants were in the land. So the king took taxes from the peasant. The peasant was the base producer, and the base producer now is not at the bottom, is some kind of middle character, while the peasant was at the bottom. If you're following what I'm saying, I mean, arguably you could argue that the slaves were at the bottom, but that's a complicated argument. There's something about the bottom.
The other argument would be that the argument about the Exodus, right, where you get a bunch of people, you have a corrupt society, you have Egypt, and then a bunch of people who are creative get together, and they leave that corrupt society and start and go on a journey into another world, rather than your model, which is it's more like, let's say, medieval Christendom, where
Okay,
it's
well, that's
static.
interesting.
It's a more static model than this dynamic model, which is, we talk about it as like the Silk Route, which combines East and West, and there's all these little schools, and they trade along the Silk Route, and it's very dynamic.
I totally agree. Yeah, that's you're adding a whole other dimension now, which is super interesting, and that I think is not the bottom. But I think the nomad has been saturated. I think we're in an era where the nomad is, and the nomad was extremely important, and still is important. It's just that we don't see the importance anymore because the whole thing is saturated. We've been there and done that. We've totally developed it, and when something is fully developed, we don't even notice it anymore. And so the vacuum right now is at the bottom, not in the nomad is actually pretty high, pretty close to the top. I think, from the point of view of sophistication and stuff, they have to be able to adjust to many cultures, and that makes them.
Yeah, you have to be able to move. I mean, it's like these people are traveling all the time, and Yeah,
And they also have to judge the
I mean,
quality
it
of
is true
products.
that the computer makes a lot of people nomadic, like it makes them able to. But again, I guess you still are talking about an elite part of the population, because most people don't spend a lot of time moving, or in
Yeah.
airplanes moving around. A lot of people do, but
Yeah. You're asking a real good point, though. The nomad, and like I was, I spent a lot of time thinking about the nomad recently. They're middlemen, basically. So they understand products, which means that they can judge the quality of a product by analyzing it,
mhm.
and then they understand who they can sell it to. So they take it to a certain group. So that takes a certain cultural sensibility. And you also have to know the language of the culture that you're taking it to. Not you at least have to know a little bit of the language in order to take a given product to another group, another cultural group, in order to sell it. But you also have to know the cultural group from whom you're buying the product. So you're doing a whole bunch of things at once. You're engaged in massive cultural exchange by dealing with these different cultures, and you're also looking at these products and estimating what's the best bet for, where can I take this to sell it? It's a very complex thing. A relationship between goods and culture and language is the middleman, because you have to know the language. You got to know a little bit of everybody of other languages. It's totally complete. And so these people are highly sophisticated people, a good middleman. So the nomad in the end was a very dynamic, it's very dynamic cultural group. Hence the Jew, right? The Jew is very much tied in with that.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking of, with these smaller cultures. And then you're almost talking like you're talking about, I like what you're doing is it, in the sense is, rather than just say, oh, they gets married and they're doomed and that sort of thing, is like, oh, no, there's a vitality there. And
At the bottom, you mean? The consummate? Yes. Oh, I totally.
And,
No, that's where the potential is. That's where it is.
But on the other hand, but because I'm sort of thinking more about the exodus.
I agree. I like your challenge there. So there's a leadership, there's an elite who will forge some new ground. Yeah.
Yeah, and then everybody will kind of follow along or.
I'm totally on side with that. I think we're in a weird age, and this has to do with technological revolution, which we've explored all these higher levels, and we're being pushed to the bottom. And so the real leadership, the real exodus, is the bottom. If you're following what I'm saying, and so they're the ones. The Moses figure will find himself at the bottom in the
just like the Jews were kind of at the bottom of the society in Egypt. They were
something like that. Sure.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
So there's a bottom. I think one of the reasons why Marxism developed, had such a powerful sway, had to do with this. We have a deep intuition for the power of the bottom. That there's something about it that, well, we don't exactly know what it is, and I think Marx got it wrong a little bit. One idea is that I might have said this to you before. The low absorbs the high. That might be the only idea from Marx from which really has a sustaining value. In other words, here's an example. There was a time when only one person understood an automobile, and it was the person who invented it.
Yeah.
And then very quickly, 5 people understood it because they were smart and had an engineering mentality. And then now millions of people understand an automobile completely. Well, what's going on there is this high idea is being pulled down to lower levels and is now just an ordinary thing, relatively. And so there's a gravitation to the bottom of all knowledge. Now, it's not entirely true what I'm saying, because
like literacy or something like that, right? I mean, it used to be just a bunch of monks reading, and then when Napoleon came along and his army was literate, they were the most powerful army in all of Europe. So when you democratize these things, and then that thing becomes just ordinary, and then there's a new thing that this becomes.
That's right. It does mediocritize.
I wonder what the new thing is now. I wonder what's the one that maybe it's something to do with artificial intelligence or.
I keep going back to waste repurposing. That's to me the new thing. It's the only new. Everything else is
the new
gone.
thing
It feels
is,
like everything's gone.
the new thing is how to repurpose everything.
Yeah.
So you're not exploiting, you're imploiting, you're not.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what that does is creates a contained system. You're not. It's what you're doing is you're always accumulating wealth. New resources still come in from the countryside and from mines and whatnot. But then since it gets repurposed over and over again, you have these cities get
fundamentally
rich.
Going back to like an indigenous kind of model, isn't it? I mean, isn't that how things you once were? And you know what I mean? Isn't it going back to the beginning on some level? What?
Totally. Except that with the advantage of the technological revolution of free market capitalism, you have the peasant, instead of just barely getting by, is rich, extremely rich.
Yeah.
Because there's so much resource in waste, right? And it's so easily repurposable because it's already been processed. You just have to give it a little bit of thought, and you don't have to dig up the ground. You don't have to pull the roots out of the tree. You don't have to. There's so much. The work was so much more intense in the past. Now, also very satisfying, but nonetheless, I have this idea that this will not be a very stressful way to live. You won't have to work that hard. You'll work a few hours a day, and then the rest of the day you're just doing whatever you want to do. You're doing different things, and therefore this allows for the new culture of the arts to emerge. When you have time, when you're not stressed about how you're going to make a living.
That's when you create art, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, me and you kind of know that because we were musicians in the 90s and nothing was going on back then. That's why we made music. I think in a way, right?
One thing I noticed is as soon as I started to work a certain number of hours in the baking, I couldn't create anymore. I was too tired.
Of course.
In other words, I started to worry about how I was going to live and how I was going to make a living.
Which is also when you have a family and all that.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. So if you
can't be dedicated single-mindedly to an artistic, but not just artistic, but something that's outside of your job. You can't. It could be agriculture, or it could be anything, but
hobby. Yeah.
But the thing is, people need that to have a full human existence. You need something like that in your life, right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you are just a slave, or you are just a wage slave. Unless you have a hobby or you have something else. It could be hairdressing. It could be anything, but it has to be something other than your boring fucking job, right? I mean,
absolutely, yeah. So I'm imagining a future where we work way less to make a living. And then we have way more time to do what interests us the most.
Yeah.
And whatever that may be. And that is the new bottom.
That's the new bottom. I think you've described sort of my lifestyle, Stephen, a little bit, but
you don't work that hard?
Well, I do. I work really hard, but only half of my actual work is teaching, and my half of my actual work is I mean, in a way, I work a lot of hours of teaching, but compared to some teachers, but I'm not a full-time administrator or anything, so I'm very independent. And then the other half of my work is this kind of thing, like having conversation with people, making podcasts, writing little articles, writing a song occasionally, and sort of like going somewhere and meeting some people in Denmark. So it is. I think a lot of people are already there in some sense.
Yeah, you've swung that.
But that is the exodus. Like that is that kind of lifestyle is the creative lifestyle exodus. It's not being very. You don't have to be very wealthy to do that. If you're clever about it, it's difficult because you're independent and you have to kind of like pay the bills every month, but.
To be fair to social democracy, we have these little nets. If we get sick, the system will pay for our sickness. So these things, these are extremely beneficial. I'm imagining a future when we won't have that, where we will have to figure out another way if we get sick to tend to health issues.
I'm not sure about that because. When I got sick recently, and I got the money I got from the government didn't come until like a year later. The bureaucracies are very inefficient.
Well, you didn't have to pay up front
and
for your
human
operation.
beings are not that inefficient. So if you have a group of friends and you have networks, then people help each other. Whereas
Totally.
if you're parasitical on the government all the time, then
Totally, which is why
you
that
don't get
system
as
is
good
going.
help. Finally, in the end, it's kind of like the welfare. It's a kind of Ivan Illich critique, is the welfare system.
Completely.
Creates sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why that system is going to disappear and die.
Yes.
It's because we're seeing the dysfunction. Nonetheless, it still has a workability. Like your operations, you didn't pay for your operations. Right?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
showed up.
No, I know. That's sorry. That's correct. Yeah, like if one had to pay for those sort of things, then you couldn't even couldn't do it. So you are still pulling from the social net.
Right. So we're slowly figuring out a new way, but we're still dependent on the old way, basically. And arguably, we're still dependent on, you can go back in time and say we're still dependent on things like our religious structures and all that kind of stuff. It's just that we don't know it. Basically, one of my arguments is that social democracy is a total parasite on the religious structure that preceded it. It's just that it doesn't know that. And a lot of it, and to make it worse, it's quite often anti-religious in its sentiment. So it's a parasite on the former religious structure and simultaneously anti-religious, which is fundamentally hypocritical. Now, Reaganism was not that. Reaganism was something else. Some kind of a return a little bit, but nonetheless, also hyper militaristic.
I don't think we want either of those options.
No, we don't. No, I'm not arguing for Reaganism. Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think
I'm saying that it makes sense that it happened. I'm saying
it makes sense is that people are going back to churches and temples and practicing meditation. Some of them are becoming Christians again, and some of them are going into Eastern practices. I think that there should be a rich ecosystem of religious practices where people and that people in different schools are kind of communicating with each other, and they have their own integrity, but it's not like a just a bland melting pot. But
okay, so now you're broaching the subject as for future civilizational rise again of the subject of spirituality, which we haven't broached on yet. So we just talked about education through the internet. We talked about repurposing. That would be the material side. Yeah. And then there's the problem of spirituality. And that's a huge one. Is there unifying spirituality? Is it desirable that there be one? These are big questions. And is it necessary to have a unifying spirituality in order to have civilization? Or can it be completely aggregated or with a loose affiliation that communicates loosely with each other and gets along? These are difficult questions. I tend to think that there has to be a unifying.
But that's because you're a Christian, and Christians always believe that it seems to be that they think that Christianity has to be the unifying one. But
well, I've come up with, this is something that I got from Rudolf Steiner, which is absolutely fascinating. He says the name for the Christ being has been around for a very long time, and going way back to the ancient Egyptian civilization. This is pre-ancient Persian. The name for it was Vishvakarma, he said. And then in the Persian, the great ancient Persian, you're going way back here. Not talking a few thousand years ago. The name in the ancient Persian was Ahura Mazda.
Ahura Mazda, yeah, but that's the savior, right?
Well, Steiner says this is actually the same being. It's the name for the same being. And then in the third era, the Egyptian civilizational era, the name for this same being, in other words, it's granted different names by different civilizational arcs. And the name.
Well, that makes more sense to me. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah. So the third name in the Egyptian civilizational arc is Osiris, and the fourth name in the Greco-Roman civilizational arc is Christ. Now these names, now Steiner makes the point that there's something extra special about the fact that this being incarnates in the Greco-Roman moment. Nonetheless, we are in a new age now, which he denotes as Anglo-American or British American, and it seems to me that if you believe Steiner that we're not quite a third of the way through this era yet. It's a long era. It lasts about 2,300 years.
So there's going to be a new version.
So I'm anticipating this is an idea I came up with this last
2.0,
month.
Jesus 2.0. It's coming.
We're in search
with
of a new
different name. Well, that's
We're in search of a
that's
new
a
name.
Jewish view in a way, because the Jewish people are waiting for the Messiah, right?
Yes,
They're
yeah,
still waiting for him to come.
yeah.
Um,
And I like that idea. So I've that idea got me really excited. I decided to drop the whole notion of Christ and denoting myself as a Christian. I'm someone in search of the new name.
Search of the new name. That's pretty cool.
But one
That's
thing,
good. I like that.
one thing the new name will signify. Like I asked myself, what does it signify? I think it does absolutely signify this notion of unified humanity. And so,
Unified humanity.
What unifies humanity is the question, and that's a tough one. So we don't have a name that unifies humanity. I don't. The best maybe liberalism is. I mean, but lots of people hate liberalism. I mean, it seemed to me that loads of people thought free speech was the cat's ass, and then all these Westerners should think free speech is terrible today. I mean, that's crazy. Can't believe Westerners are against free speech. But that's what wokists are, kind of against free speech if you listen to what they're up to.
Well,
they think free speech is bad
because they don't want you to hurt their feelings. I mean,
well, there's a
it's an infantile view. It's like you don't want somebody to hurt your feelings because you're different and you want to protect yourself and your group. But I mean, we have to be adults and sort of like be able to
be as fair as possible.
Say things that are somewhat. Anyway, go ahead.
Totally, yeah, I agree. I mean, we agree on this. We agree. But to be a little bit fair to wokists, they're saying if we don't want to persecute or lend ourselves to persecution, we have to conduct our language in a certain way. Seems to me.
Yeah,
and
but
so
they
that's
don't.
a compelling
but again,
argument to someone. What?
But again, it's.
Oh, it's wrong.
It's wrong. It's wrong.
Compelling argument. Yeah,
it's a compelling argument. It is compelling. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many wokists out there. Yes, we can't. You can't behave this way. You can't say the N-word, and for good reason. I mean, I think that's a good thing that people are not using that word. So there are taboos and there are boundaries. It's like, but I think that. I think it's the policing issue that is ugly.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, you and I, we agree on this. It's just that you can see why they're. Anyway, I'm only bringing up this free speech thing so as to point to the idea that we don't have a unifying idea. Maybe federation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a unifying idea. Maybe everybody in the world is kind of okay with the idea that we can federate the world's cultures and.
Well, I know Dugan had this idea that there's sort of three, there should be kind of, he calls it the fourth political way, that there should be sort of like the Americas and Europe is one sort of, this is imperium, and then the Russian, I forget what he calls it, the Eurasian is another imperium, and so there's these massive, and they're different. That's his theory. It's an interesting theory.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think today there are three, possibly four sovereign zones in the world. One is one led up by the United States. One is one led up by Russia, and the other by China. And it's possible there's a fourth, which is the Arab Muslim world.
And the African,
But that's not. It's not a sovereign. Africa is not a sovereign entity. It's carved up and under. It's under the influence of other sovereign entities. Put it this way, there are only 3 or 4 sovereign entities in the world today. And Europe, I think because of the 2 world wars, has backed away from its real sovereign responsibility. And so it's basically abrogated it to the U.S. They basically let the U.S. lead. And then when the U.S. fucks up, they like to criticize them and go on about how stupid the Americans are. But they basically won't take leadership. You can see this with the Ukraine war. They don't seem to be interested in taking any real leadership when it comes to sovereignty issues, real sovereign issues.
Yeah, I've heard that criticism. Yeah.
So, which means that the European sovereign entity is under the umbrella of the American one. It's part of the American sovereign umbrella. And Russia has its own sovereign umbrella, and China does too.
Yeah.
and the Arabs or the Muslims somehow have something going on. It seems like we're not very good at telling the Muslims what to do. They have their own way of booting us out and telling us to fuck off. And
Oh yeah, well.
so there's a sense in which we can't
or the
control
Chinese or the Russians.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah, we can't tell the Russians or the Chinese what to do, and I don't think we can. The Arabs they're not really unified. They're kind of they're a bit ragtag. You know, they got their Arab League, but nonetheless, we don't have control.
They're at war with each other as well, which is why they don't become the most powerful.
Yeah, that's right.
Thing in the world, because that's the reason that they haven't taken over the world.
They're too busy fucking each other over.
Sharia law is that they're at war with each other.
Yeah. They don't get along enough. Except every now and then they do unify to boot us out, kind of thing, right? They hate us being meddled in the game.
Yeah.
No, that's true. That's absolutely right. So that sounds like I agree with this guy Dugan. Sounds like he's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
We should.
But he is Putin's. Remember when we're saying this, he's Putin's number one advisor, and he's very pro-war.
Oh, really?
But he also has a lot of interesting ideas. He's one of these very mixed characters. I don't side with him because I think he's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I read this book about him recently, and he's an absolutely brilliant guy. But he has some odd. I guess the fact that he would be pro-war, pro imperialism makes he's a traditionalist. So he wants to go back to something. And that's I think position that we want to take something from the past and move forward. We don't want to go back to some golden age. There's a bit of that in Dugan, but although he would deny it. He's a complex guy, but when he's Putin's brain.
This business. So we're talking about sovereignty right now, and I spent a lot of time this past year thinking about sovereignty. I'd love to talk more. I think we've said enough today. We should.
Yeah.
But I believe sovereignty. First of all, we're in an age where war is redundant. In other words, if we really go to war. By the way, this is the reason why we didn't step in like arguably we should have to defend the Ukrainians. Now we're providing arms for them, but the reason why we haven't stepped in is because we're afraid that a real war will break out, that a major war.
Oh yeah.
And the reason why we don't want that is because we know that a major war is actually a redundant thing today. We can only have proxy wars. Yeah. And that's because war is basically because of the power.
War is existential, obviously. Yeah. I mean,
it's a thing of the past. And so what is the future of sovereignty in an age when war is redundant? What happens to sovereignty? Well, it carries on, but how does it carry on is the question. And the answer is something, it harkens back to Jordan Peterson a bit, actually. It really has to do with the free flow of free speech and of integrated individuals. The more you have distinguished individuals, the stronger your entity is, your sovereign entity is, and the less you can be controlled. But it doesn't have a lot to do anymore with powerful weapons. It's because each side has powerful weapons, and then
that's interesting because that's kind of that would be Putin's critique of the West, right? Is that we're all weak,
There's something about
and we're soulless consumers, and we've kind of
we've definitely gone down that route.
But I mean, it's not that they have any more soul in Russia than they do in the West. I don't think so. I think it's that's a seductive kind of argument.
Yeah. No, we're lost for sure. We're definitely lost. And there is a sense in which an individual can really only properly integrate if he makes himself vulnerable. And so calling Westerners weak has a lot to do with that. We have deliberately constructed a vulnerability